Hi, I'm John, and this is the second of a three-part series in which I'm upgrading my N-scale long-distance Amtrak train set in order to turn it into a collection centerpiece. In episode 1, I replaced the old SoundTraxx decoder with a new SoundTraxx KN1 and added independent control to the ditch lights. In this episode, I'm upgrading the second P42 in a similar fashion, but I'm also going to add independently controllable marker lights to the front and rear of the model, using the Wutter Vehicles and Details NEXT18 adapter board and a SoundTraxx TSU-N18. I'm doing this project because I've wanted a centerpiece for my N-scale collection, and I think a long-distance Amtrak train would qualify. And I also wanted to expand my modeling horizons a bit. I want to thank Alvin Ho of Wutter Vehicles and Details for generously providing the adapter board for this project, and also SoundTraxx for sending the TSU-N18 DCC decoder I'm installing onto that same board. You can find the WVD NEXT18 adapter in train shops, both brick and mortar and online, and you can also find the TSU-N18 as well in brick and mortar shops and online. I have also included a list of most of the tools and materials I used for this project in the video description below. So let's go to the workbench and get started. I'll spread the shell slightly with my fingernails and the chassis drops out. Next, I'll carefully remove the SoundTraxx decoder. I have it taped in with Kapton tape here. And I was never really that happy with this decoder, so this will be good. One of the things I was really unhappy about was the sound, and you can see why. I just had the speaker taped down to this piece of styrene. To be honest, I'm not even sure why I reinstalled this little clip. It wasn't really serving any purpose. And I am being careful because I want to be able to preserve this decoder if I can. You can see the contacts to the motor were soldered, and you can also see they weren't soldered very well. My soldering skills gotten better, but it's something I definitely need to work on. The one good thing about this soldering is it's not huge blobs on there. It was just enough to hold the contacts down. That makes taking them off a lot easier. And then once it's all unsoldered, you just slide the decoder forward and it comes out. If you aren't removing an existing decoder in your project, you need to put Kapton tape on your contact strips. The Kapton tape needs to go all the way around the strip, and it lines up with where the motor tabs come up from inside the chassis there. So make sure you do that, or else you will blow up your decoder, and that's very expensive. So to install the WVD NEXT18 adapter board, you just put it where the old decoder was and slide it back so that it seats on this little tab here. And you can fold down your motor tabs just like this. And remember, these don't have to be a friction fit. So when you fold them down, just make sure they're over these pads. And we're going to solder them to those pads. First, I'm going to put some flux on the pads and on the tabs so that the solder flows. Then it's just a matter of putting the solder on there. And I'm still not great at soldering, but the important thing is that the connections are being made between the motor tabs and the pads on the board. So having the motor tabs soldered to the board and having this little tab back here seated properly will hold everything in place. You need to remove the cab because we're going to work on some of the light pipes and stuff in there. And then in the back, there's another light pipe and some stuff that needs to be done with this little assembly as well. So in the cab, there are these little plugs that fill up the marker lights. And if you look, you can see that the tabs that hold this little plug assembly in the cab line up above where the actual marker lights are. They're down here, just above the ditch lights. So that's where we're going to have to drill. Then on the back assembly, the same thing applies. This little plug thing does not line up with where the marker lights go. It's inside just next to the headlights, but the marker lights are further out toward the edge of the locomotive. So we're going to have to drill holes for those as well. Now that I removed that little marker light plug out of the cab assembly, I'm going to put it back in the shell, and just want to make sure to be careful not to break anything, obviously. Once it's back in the shell, you can see that the ditch lights line up where they're supposed to be. That means that the cab is seated properly inside the shell. And from this angle, you can see that the little plugs are no longer there. That's opened up an opportunity for me to drill a hole to run some fiber optic strands. The rear headlight assembly goes back in, just like we did in the front. And I'm going to make sure that the headlight's lined up, and it is. And once again, you can see that the marker light plugs are not present, so I can use this number 76 drill bit to mark on that little assembly where those holes need to go. And I'm holding it in place with my index finger on my left hand so that it doesn't shift around in there. Once I have those marked, I can take the assembly back out and make some nice clean holes. I put the assembly back in the shell to test fit, and you can see it's perfect. I'm going to repeat the process on the front, marking the holes with the cab installed, and then taking it out and making the holes clean with the cab out of the shell. I want to talk to you about something else while I'm doing this. If you're wondering how I knew I needed a number 76 drill bit, here's the answer. I'm using 2100ths fiber optic strands, and I found this little cheat sheet on the internet. I don't remember where I found it, but it's very handy. If you search for the same thing, cheat sheet for drill bits or something like that on Google or your favorite search engine, you can find a bunch of these. This just happens to be the one that I saved. And it'll tell you which drill bit you need for which size of fiber optic. It's right over here. 76 equals 0.020. All right, with that mystery solved, I want to talk to you about this headlight glass and the number board. If you're not careful, those can fall out. I'm going to take the headlight glass out and I'm going to glue it using some canopy glue. I've already done this with the number board at some point because it fell out and I didn't want to lose it again. But if you use canopy glue to glue the headlight glass in, it'll stay put and you don't have to worry about losing it or having to search for it because it fell out of the model. I have to cut the ditch light pipes off of the main light pipe because I don't want the ditch lights to come on when I turn on the headlight. So I'm using my flush cutters to remove those. Once the ditch light pipes are removed, I can reinsert the headlight pipe and use canopy glue to hold it in place. And I'm using canopy glue for all this stuff because it dries clear. If you use CA, it may cloud the glass and affect the amount of light that gets through. While that's drying, I'm going to turn my attention to the fiber optics. I need to make a flared end on this fiber optic strand to simulate the lens of the marker light. And I found that using my soldering iron does a really good job of this. It's easier to control than other heat sources. It may take a few tries, especially if this is your first time doing it, but once you're happy with the lens you've created, you can paint that lens with some Tamiya clear red paint, and that'll make it look red even when the light is off. I've decided it would be easiest to just glue surface mount LEDs to the light pipes that came with the locomotive, so the headlight and ditch lights will be lit this way. So I'm going to cut a little bit more off of the ditch light pipes, and I'm polishing the parts that I've cut with 1000 grit sandpaper to make sure that there's not a rough edge that obstructs light. Gluing a surface mount LED to the end of a light pipe is a fussy process, but I find that if you're patient with it and take your time, you can get it stuck on there. The key is to let it dry for at least an hour and then to add a little bit more glue after that. And once it's done, you'll have something that stays together pretty well. So follow my thought process here. I'm putting this little ditch light assembly, I'll call it, into a small piece of heat shrink tubing. And the reason why is I'm figuring if I use this the way it's set up, it'll prevent light leaks from happening. And I can put this back in the cab like so. And my hope is that these shrouds will protect the ditch lights from getting light contamination from the headlight pipe and vice versa. So this is what it looks like when it's all together. But I want to mention, this is a little spoiler alert. I found a better way, and I'll tell you what that is later. But in the meantime, we'll put the cab back in very carefully, and it seems like a good time to test the lights. So off camera here, I have a 9-volt battery hooked up with a 1000 ohm resistor. Never test your LEDs with a straight 9-volt battery because you will blow them up. You always use a resistor to prevent that. And I'd say it looks pretty good. So now that I'm satisfied with what the headlight and ditch lights look like, I can thread the fiber optics of my marker lights through the holes that I drilled. And then I just push them in to make sure they're flush with the surface of the locomotive. And you can see that I've threaded these through and put them into a piece of heat shrink tubing, and then put a slightly larger piece of heat shrink tubing over that. And the idea that I have here is I put a red surface mount LED into this piece of heat shrink tubing and mated them up to hopefully limit light leakage. And then I test it with the lights off in the room to make sure that the marker lights look good, and I think they look great. Another spoiler alert. I did not check to see how the ditch lights and headlights might affect the marker lights, but you'll see how I deal with that later. So at this point, I'm satisfied with all the lights in front, with the caveat that I just mentioned to you a second ago. So I labeled each light and put it into a piece of heat shrink tubing that is not shrunk, just to keep it tidy and out of the way while I work on the back. I'm taking the light pipe out of the rear headlight assembly, and I'm going to glue a surface mount LED to it using canopy glue, just like I did on the other light pipes in the front. It's a little bit easier because the light pipe in the back has a lot more surface to put the surface mount LED on it, but it's still pretty fussy, and it does require time to let the glue dry. And I also did a couple applications of canopy glue after each application dried, just to make sure it would stay put. Reinstalling the light pipe is pretty easy. It's kind of a snap fit in there. I have to coax it with my skewer, but once it's seated properly, the light pipes stick out, and that's the part that actually goes through the shell. So I'll carefully reinsert the rear headlight assembly and test it. Looks good. So at this point, I can thread the fiber optic strands for the marker lights through the holes that I drilled in the rear headlight assembly. Now here's a cool trick that I wished I had thought of when I was doing the front. I've taken a small piece of heat shrink tubing and very carefully cut a slit down one side using an X-Acto blade. It's only about 1/8 of an inch or maybe 1/4 of an inch deep. I can then use that slit to not only hold the surface mount LED, but I can also use it to aim the LED. And once that's done, I can put a little bit of canopy glue on the back of it to secure it in place. I'm going to put these fiber optics into the end of this little light pipe that I just created with the LED in it. And then I'm going to take some tape and stick that whole thing up to the inside top of the shell. And I'm going to do this off camera because it's kind of hard to work inside here. Now for a quick test. Yeah, looks good. So at this point, all my lights in the front of the locomotive are wired and installed, and all my lights in the back of the locomotive are wired and installed, and it's just a matter now of making the connections to the adapter board. The adapter board I'm using has 7 auxiliary functions. The marker lights are going to be on auxiliary 4 and auxiliary 3, and then my ditch lights are going to be on auxiliary 1 and auxiliary 2. and it's just a matter of soldering these connections onto the adapter board. I'm cutting some of the wires from the front of the locomotive shorter so that I don't have a big mess under the shell. So here's what it looks like when it's all wired up. I have the rear headlight wired to the back here. All my auxiliaries are wired to the auxiliary outputs here. The front headlight is connected up here, and I'll connect the speaker leads here. This is an 8x12 millimeter speaker inserted into an enclosure. I'm going to seal the edges and this little hole that I found on the side of the enclosure using black silicone RTV. I suppose you could use canopy glue or CA or anything that gives it an airtight seal. The key is to give it an airtight seal so that it will sound as good as it possibly can. And one other thing I want to mention is I removed some of the enclosure by sanding it with sandpaper, just to be sure that it's going to fit under the shell without any problems. So here's what it looks like with the speaker wires soldered and the speaker installed. It just sits right in between these two contact strips. It fits perfectly there and doesn't interfere with anything. Since the polarity of the speaker wires doesn't matter when you're using only one speaker, I just used some of the scrap wire that was hanging around from when I trimmed the other wires when I was connecting the lights. Alright, so I have a Tsunami 2 TSU-N18 decoder here. I've put some Kapton tape on it just to be safe. And you just plug it in by snapping it down. You can hear it click into place on the Next 18 socket. Now I've taped it down using some Kapton tape. That'll make sure it doesn't move around once I put the shell back on. Then it's just a matter of very carefully putting the shell back on, being careful not to squeeze any wires anywhere. And we can go test this thing. So I want to back up for just a second and explain something that I had to correct. When I ran my first light test on the test track, I found that the headlight was creating light leaks in both the marker lights and the ditch lights. The ditch lights were creating light leaks in the headlight, and when the ditch lights and the headlight were all on, it made it look like the marker lights were on when they weren't. So I opened the locomotive back up, and I used black acrylic paint to paint over the fiber optics and over the headlight pipe, because they were unshrouded when I put it together the first time. And I did something similar in the back to protect the rear marker lights from having light leaks when the rear headlight was on. I was talking to Alvin, the creator of the Next 18 adapter board, shortly after that, and he gave me a great idea. He said he uses silver paint to paint over fiber optics and light pipes in order to prevent light leaks, because silver paint is opaque, but it actually creates a reflective surface around the outside of the fiber optic or light pipe so that the light doesn't become dimmer. I guess when you use black acrylic paint like I did, it makes everything a little bit dimmer. Alright, our next step is to go to the SoundTraxx website and go to the Reference tab and click on Manuals. Here we will find the Tsunami 2 digital sound decoders. And then go down here to where the Tsunami 2 GE Sound Selection Reference Guide is. And this gives you all of the CVs that you need to change or select in order to make the model sound the way you want it to sound. So if you look on this reference sheet, you can see that the default for CV123 is set to 2, and that's the GE7FDL 16 prime mover, which is what we need. And right below that, the air compressor is the whooping sound. That's CV124 set to 1, and that's also what we want. But I'll use this reference to pick the horn sound that I like the most and things like that. And something else that's worth noting is that when you're using JMRI, which I do, and the decoder you're using is so new that it's not in JMRI yet, you can still make changes to it, at least in the case of SoundTraxx decoders. You just pick one of their existing decoders that's in the same family as the one you have, And then you can change the CVs using the CV change function on Decoder Pro. So you just have to know which CV you need to change and which value you need. In my case, I had to call and get some help for that. So just something to think about. So there we have it. Part 2 is in the books. This episode represents what I feel is a big step for me as a model railroader. Up to this point, I had never added independently controllable marker lights to any model, let alone one that's so small. My plan is for this unit to be the leader on the train once I get it all done. I mentioned in episode 1 that I wanted to use all the same color LEDs for the headlights and ditch lights, which is exactly what I did for this model. That way, the headlight will look the same as the ditch lights. That's what I've seen on the prototypes when I've been out trackside. What I've done in this program is a huge improvement over what the model was prior to being upgraded, and also the more modern decoders have way better motor control than the ones I took out of the locomotives, and the addition of a speaker enclosure helped the sound significantly. As with the first episode, I feel like my soldering could use some help, and there are still a few minor tweaks I'll be making to the decoder's settings to make it perfect, but we've done enough here to demonstrate that it's probably not as hard as you think to customize your models to make them even cooler than they were when you took them out of the box. I hope that by showing you my mistakes as well as my successes, that it'll give you the inspiration you need to get started on your own project. In the next episode, we'll upgrade the coaches with interior lighting as well as making marker lights on the end car. If you find this content useful or entertaining, consider supporting my work by signing up on Patreon at patreon.com/tsgmultimedia. You're also invited to hit the thumbs up button and share the video with your friends on social media. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.